know what you're thinking. Jaws? Overlooked? How ridiculous. And you'd be right. But this is a personal piece about Jaws as it impacted the UK and more immediately me as a small child. Some of these are stories that have become lost in the Jaws mythology, with people forgetting, or more likely never knowing, just how films were distributed, seen and merchandised back in the 1970s. For a period of my youth, I believed Jaws to be the pinnacle of filmmaking achievement, and I still think that it's a perfectly crafted piece of cinema, one that you can watch over and over again and still take satisfaction from, even if the shocks and surprises no longer shock or surprise quite as much. As everyone knows, Jaws opened in the summer of 1975 and was an immediate sensation. It was the first of the summer blockbusters, in fact, though perhaps more by luck than design. It would be Star Wars a couple of years later that set the template for what we now have, and I would still remove Jaws from that history of increasingly cynical SFX spectaculars that are ruthlessly marketed as this year's big summer hit. Jaws is perhaps less the point when the director-driven new cinema of the 1970s gave way to studio spectacle than it is the first crack, with George Lucas's film leading to the inevitable collapse. By early 1970 standards, Jaws was a merchandising juggernaut. By modern, or simply by post-1977 standards, it was barely merchandised at all, and most of that was hurriedly arranged after the film's massive success. You didn't walk into toy shops prior to release and see endless amounts of Jaws merchandise. In fact, as a kid, it was entirely possible to be completely unaware that the film even existed until it arrived at your local cinema. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now we have the official version of the Jaws release history. Let's go back to the mid-1970s when films were distributed internationally in a way that would be unthinkable today. As we have noted, Jaws opened on June the 20th, 1975 in the USA. In Britain, the film would not be seen until Christmas Day, and then only in London. If you weren't around at the time, you might look at old movie press ads and wonder why national advertising hyped London screenings above anything else. Well, London tended to get films before everyone else in the UK. It would then filter out to the bigger cities and would eventually play the smaller towns and cities once the big places were done with it. Jaws made its way to national release on New Year's Day. Anyway, all this preamble is to really explain that I can't quite put my finger on exactly when I first saw Jaws, other than it was probably sometime in January 1976. It was the opening day in my hometown, but guessing late in the day on the national scale. I was, at this time, entirely oblivious to the existence of Jaws. I was 9 years old, and whatever media hype there had been had entirely passed me by. But clearly my dad was aware of it. "Do you want to go to the pictures?" he asked casually one Sunday afternoon. In the sort of faux choice that we're all used to in modern politics, I was then given 2 screenings to choose from. Did I want to see The Jungle Book, then on re-release? Or did I want to see this film Jaws about a giant shark? Well, that was a decision that didn't take long. I've been working through the Disney re-releases since I was first taken to the cinema. Not necessarily by choice, it must be said, but you took what was an offer at the time. But The Jungle Book didn't stand a chance against a giant shark. In retrospect, I wonder how disappointed my dad would have been if I'd plunked for the Disney film. He knew me well enough to know that there was little chance of that, but still. On our walk to the local cinema, he told me all about the mechanical shark that the film used, along with other bits of trivia that suggested he was very keen to see this film himself, and I was probably just an excuse for him to go. The fact that a 9-year-old could go see Jaws in 1976 is fascinating in itself. Here was a film being hyped as the most terrifying ever made, with severed limbs, kids being eaten, and one scene, you know the one, that has constantly made audiences jump out of their skin. Watching the film on various re-releases over the years, it became quite the challenge not to jump at this scene, which you knew was coming but could never quite predict and prep for. It took several viewings to reach the point where it didn't at least give a little jolt. To the point, Jaws wasn't seen as a horror film. It was a thriller, an adventure film, call it what you want, but not a horror film. In fairness, even many of the older horror fans of the time tended to dismiss the ideas of Jaws as being a horror movie. Some still do. Jaws was passed with an A, now a PG, which meant that kids could attend unaccompanied. Notably, the film also had nudity in the opening scene, though how much bare flesh you saw very much depended on the cinema projectionist settings. Hype works wonders, especially for kids, and by the time we reached the cinema, I was all set for the most terrifying experience of my life. Curiously, although I already loved horror films, my mother, for reasons best known to herself, had decided that I was squeamish. She'd also talked me into believing I had travel sickness for years, so go figure. So the idea of seeing this film about a shark eating people seemed scarily challenging. The discovery of Chrissy's body on the beach, telegraphed as it was, seemed too much, and I covered my eyes. But that was early in the movie, and by the time the rest of the bloody violence happened, I was fully engrossed in the story, and no way were my eyes leaving the screen. So yeah, Jaws was an experience unlike anything else. It was beyond everything that I'd seen at that time. Love at first sight, you might say. In the days before home video, films would be theatrically reissued frequently. The bigger a film was, the longer it usually took to appear on TV, and so you could have several re-releases before seeing it on the small screen. Jaws finally made its UK TV debut on ITV on October the 8th, 1981, where it attracted an audience of 23.25 million viewers, almost half the British population at the time. Before then, Jaws would come back to the cinema every couple of years, which was pretty standard at the time. I would attend every new release. Of course, it was a case of diminishing returns as things went along. I went to the first re-release with a bunch of schoolmates, the next with a couple of mates, and by the end was there on my own. The first re-release played in a packed theatre. Subsequent screenings were less busy, though the film still attracted an audience. All in all, I saw the movie 4 times in the cinema over a 5-year period. After the first re-release, other blockbuster films were competing for attention, but I remained loyal. I've got a photograph of myself and a school friend meeting Darth Vader at a holiday resort. I'm wearing a Jaws necklace and badge, keeping the faith in the face of the new conqueror. As I mentioned earlier, you could certainly find Jaws merchandise, both official and otherwise, but not huge amounts, at least not by modern standards. There were the usual movie tie-ins, the soundtrack album, a new edition of the novel, which oddly didn't make a big deal of the movie, and making-of books, both official in the form of Cal Gottlieb's The Jaws Log and unofficial like Edith Blake's The Making of the Movie Jaws, alongside various cash-in magazines and books about shark attacks. Then there were the oddities that came along, as well as the necklace I had, and indeed still have, the coffee mug, sew-on patch, long-lost things like a Jaws t-shirt, I've replaced that with other Jaws t-shirts since, a badge, a shark in a bottle model kit, and the frankly disappointing Jaws game. You could buy Jaws corn snacks, Jaws beach towels. There was also Lalo Schifrin's disco version of the John Williams theme, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is quite something. And Jeff Love's Big Terror movie themes, which existed primarily to cash in on Jaws fever, hence the giant shark on the cover. On top of this, toy shops were full of rubber sharks of varying sizes and qualities. There were the arcade games, one of which appears in the film and found new life as a result. posters and spoofs like Ted Rogers' 1976 single Beware of Mr. Shark. Opportunist distributors re-released the 1971 film Blue Water, White Death, with the posters rather hiding the fact that this was a documentary about sharks rather than a new horror film. And of course, there would be the long-lived Universal Tours attraction. I've no doubt that there was more out there, but don't be fooled. Most of the Jaws merch that you'll see now appeared many years after the film was released. You can see my full video on my collection of Jaws novelty on our sister site Desperate Living. I'll include the link below. There were the knockoff movies, of course, though surprisingly most that appeared in the immediate wake of Jaws avoided using sharks, instead taking the basic narrative and adapting it to another rampaging creature. There was Grizzly, Tentacles, Orca and Piranha, as well as the rather dismal TV movie Shark Kill. And of course we had comic strips like the infamous Hookjaw, possibly the goriest comic strip ever published in the UK, and Gums. Weird pop culture crossovers like the Jaws character in the Bond films, and various comedy sketches and advertising knockoffs.
From the studios that first dared to bring to the cinema stories of the magnitude of Moby Dick, the Old Man of the Sea, the Poseidon Adventure, now comes the supreme definitive drama of the Predator Man in his age-old battle with the deep. The spine-chilling horror that has shocked America comes searing across your screens.
The more specific Italian copycats like Great White didn't appear for several years. Of course, the official Jaws sequels began to feel like parodies very quickly. While Jaws 2 isn't bad, Jaws 3 and Jaws the Revenge are more like cheap imitations than actual sequels. When the Italian knockoffs start to feel more authentic than the official sequel, you know you're in trouble. I kept going to see these movies, but it felt more and more like an ordeal than a pleasure. Maybe the plans to satirize the film with Jaws 3 People 0 made more sense after all. Better a knowing spoof than an unwitting one. The decline of Jaws as a cultural force was sad to see. It's inconceivable now to imagine the most financially successful film ever made winding up with a sequel like Jaws the Revenge within 12 years. But while people see the film as the start of the summer blockbuster, in many ways Jaws was still part of an era where sequels were still seen as movies that will always make less money than the film that came before, made as standalone films for as long as the profits held up, and nobody really thought about a franchise. Even with films that actually were franchises like Planet of the Apes. As the UK TV viewing figures showed, Jaws was still a very big deal in 1981, but it was never going to be Star Wars. The real influence of Jaws would not come for several decades, with a feeding frenzy of shark exploitation in the 2000s thanks to CGI, and the discovery that there was an apparently insatiable demand for ever more ludicrous shark movies, from the legendary Sharknado and Sharktopus, through to bizarre efforts like Shark Exorcist, Ghost Shark, Two-Headed Shark Attack, Ouija Shark, and Ninja vs. Shark. While a few of the 21st century shark films have been serious works that show how the concept can still create fear and tension, films like Open Water and Adrift, most of these novelty movies have reduced the shark to a cartoonish figure. On the plus side, the existence of a few hundred gimmicky shark films has probably helped to keep a Jaws remake off the table, so at least they're serving some purpose. Today, Jaws is a beloved classic, so it's hard to remember that in the 1980s and beyond, thanks to the increasingly shoddy sequels and the contempt of familiarity, as well as Steven Spielberg moving into family entertainment populism and seemingly putting the film behind him, Jaws wasn't all that highly regarded. Still critically acclaimed if anyone reviewed it, but not seen as all that important, and certainly not on the level of the big sci-fi blockbusters of the era. Mad, I know. It took a long time for the film to be acknowledged as one of the most important films of the decade, or of all time. It's been a slow resurrection, but a welcome one. When Jaws was re-released in 2012, now with a 12A BBFC certificate, the film being seen as too intense for a PG despite 36 years of not causing any problems with that rating, I went along once again. Old habits die hard. We were fortunate to be sat in front of a student who'd never seen the film before, and so who became an unwitting test of just how well this movie, now almost 4 decades old, still worked. When that scene appeared, it was highly gratifying to see him react in exactly the same way that original audiences had, shouting out loud and throwing his drink and popcorn in the air. A perfect scare remains a perfect scare. When did you first see Jaws? And do you think of it as a horror film or not? Let us know in the comments. And of course, if you enjoy this nostalgic look back, give this video the thumbs up, and if you've yet to do so, hit the subscribe button. We tell a lot more obscure stories on this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.